Behind the walls of the Ottoman Harem, power was not held by kings alone. It was shaped by whispers, secrets, and women history tried to forget. Which is impressive because it was actually one of the most politically dangerous rooms on Earth. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The Ottoman Harem might be the most misunderstood institution in history, which is impressive considering history has spent centuries misunderstanding absolutely everything. Mention the word harem, and most people immediately picture silk cushions, lounging women, and a life of luxurious boredom punctuated by dramatic fainting. In other words, a Renaissance painting that has never met reality and isn't particularly interested in doing so. The truth is much less exciting in the way movies hate and much more exciting in the way politics loves. The harem was not a pleasure palace. It was an administrative machine, a carefully regulated, tightly supervised environment attached directly to the core of imperial power. If it helps, imagine a government office, but with fountains, etiquette, and significantly higher stakes for making the wrong comment at the wrong time. Nothing inside the harem was casual. Not movement, not conversation, not even silence. Silence itself had rank. Everyone knew who outranked whom, who was watching, and who had absolutely too much free time and an excellent memory for mistakes. A large part of the confusion comes from European observers who saw something unfamiliar and immediately assumed moral collapse. The idea that women could exist near political power without chaos offended them on a spiritual level, so they wrote about decadence instead. Travel diaries became gossip columns, gossip became scholarship, and scholarship became confident nonsense. But the Ottomans were under no illusions. The harem existed to control access, manage succession, and reduce instability. It was designed to prevent scandal, not produce it. Ironically, this is precisely why it generated so much intrigue. When you put ambitious, intelligent people next to power and tell them to be quiet forever, they do not become peaceful. They become strategic. Very few women in the harem ever met the sultan in private. Even fewer stayed relevant long enough to matter. Beauty faded. Intelligence endured. Memory was currency. Timing was everything. And mistakes were remembered with the kind of dedication normally reserved for family grudges. The real scandal isn't that the Ottoman harem was full of intrigue. The real scandal is that people thought it was about pleasure. It wasn't. It was about control, patience, and survival with better curtains. And wherever that combination exists, history stops being polite and starts being interesting. Contrary to popular imagination, women did not simply wander into the Ottoman harem because someone thought they looked good in silk. This was not an open casting call. It was a highly controlled intake system run with the enthusiasm of a bureaucracy and the subtlety of a locked door. Women entered the harem through several routes, none of which involved a dramatic romantic backstory. Some were captives from war. Some were purchased through legal slave markets. Some were sent as diplomatic gifts, because nothing says we respect your empire like carefully selected human beings. This may sound harsh, but it was entirely normal by the standards of the time, which is history's way of saying, don't apply modern logic unless you enjoy headaches. Once inside, however, the story changed. The harem did not operate on chaos or indulgence. It operated on sorting. New arrivals were evaluated immediately. Intelligence, temperament, memory, adaptability, and discipline mattered far more than appearance. Beauty was common, competence was not, and competence was what kept you alive and relevant. Most women would never meet the sultan, ever. They were assigned roles, duties, and ranks, and many lived quiet lives serving higher-ranking women or managing internal tasks. Think less constant intrigue and more high-stakes boarding school where mistakes follow you forever. The idea that every woman in the harem was competing for the sultan's attention is one of the greatest myths ever produced by bored outsiders. In reality, drawing attention too early was dangerous. Attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant expectations. And expectations had a nasty habit of turning into punishments. The system was designed to observe before rewarding. Women were trained for years before any possibility of advancement. They learned languages, religion, etiquette, poetry, music, calligraphy, history, and court protocol. Not because these were hobbies, but because ignorance in the harem was dangerous. If you misunderstood a rule, you didn't get corrected gently, you got remembered. Education wasn't about self-expression, it was about control. Knowing exactly when to speak, when to bow, when to remain perfectly still, and when to disappear emotionally from a room was a survival skill. The most educated women weren't the loudest or most impressive, they were the ones no one noticed making mistakes, ever. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Intelligence was a threat, a useful threat, but a threat nonetheless. The harem valued cleverness only when it came wrapped in obedience.
Too much ambition, too visible a mind, and suddenly tutors stopped praising you and started monitoring you, which is palace language for "we are concerned." Music and poetry weren't taught for romance, they were taught because they revealed discipline. Anyone could learn a melody, very few could perform it flawlessly under observation without revealing nerves. That mattered. Court life rewarded people who could remain graceful while being evaluated like livestock with better posture. Memory was perhaps the most important skill of all. Who outranked whom, who favored whom, who had offended whom 3 years ago and pretended it never happened. The harem ran on memory, and forgetting was often worse than ignorance. Forgetting meant you hadn't been paying attention, and not paying attention was how people vanished quietly. Education was the first filter. Those who adapted survived. Those who didn't were reassigned, sidelined, or quietly removed from relevance. The system did not shout. It did not need to. By the time a woman advanced, she had already been shaped by years of observation and correction. She knew the rules, she knew the risks, and most importantly, she knew that knowledge itself was power as long as you pretended it wasn't. Because in the Ottoman harem, education wasn't about learning, it was about learning not to be obvious. In the Ottoman harem, attention was not affection, it was not romance, it was not validation. Attention was currency, unstable, highly valuable currency that could appreciate overnight or collapse without warning. And like all dangerous currencies, it ruined people who misunderstood it. The Sultan's attention did not mean you were special, it meant you were visible. And visibility inside the harem was a double-edged blade that everyone pretended not to notice while carefully stepping around it. A single glance, a brief conversation, an invitation to perform music or poetry. These moments were noticed by everyone. Who stood nearby? Who was absent? Who reacted too quickly? Who smiled too widely? The harem had no privacy in the modern sense. Everything happened in front of witnesses who remembered details with alarming dedication. Receiving attention too early was risky. Attention created expectations. Expectations created pressure. Pressure created mistakes, and mistakes had consequences that did not come with second chances. The smartest women understood this and did something deeply counterintuitive. They avoided attention, or at least they delayed it. Remaining useful but unremarkable was often the safest position. Manage tasks well, speak when required, perform competently, not brilliantly. Excellence was dangerous. Perfection attracted rivals. Rivals attracted scrutiny. Scrutiny attracted trouble. When attention did arrive, it had to be managed carefully. Too much warmth invited jealousy. Too much distance suggested ingratitude. Too much emotion suggested instability. The correct response was somewhere between grateful restraint and dignified calm, a balance so precise that missing it by a fraction could change everything. And once attention faded, because it always did, the fall could be brutal. Favor was temporary. The harem never allowed anyone to forget that a woman who had once been summoned regularly could find herself waiting indefinitely, surrounded by people who remembered her former status with thin smiles and perfect manners. The most dangerous moment wasn't receiving attention, it was losing it, because loss signaled weakness, and weakness invited replacement. This constant rise and fall created a culture of extreme self-control. Emotions were hidden, reactions were delayed, triumph was muted, disappointment was swallowed whole. The harem rewarded those who could remain unreadable, not because they felt nothing, but because showing it was expensive. Attention in the Ottoman harem was not a reward, it was an investment, and every investment came with risk. Those who survived longest weren't the ones who received the most attention. They were the ones who knew exactly how much they could afford to receive. In many royal courts, having a child, especially a son, was considered protection. In the Ottoman harem, it was more like activating hard mode. Motherhood didn't bring peace, it brought attention, expectation, and a spotlight so bright it exposed every possible weakness. When a woman gave birth to a son, she didn't become safe, she became relevant, and relevance inside the harem was dangerous. A prince was not just a child, he was a future problem waiting to grow up. Every son represented a potential claim to the throne, and multiple claims had a long, proud history of ending in bloodshed. The Ottomans were painfully aware of this, which is why succession was treated less like a celebration and more like a controlled explosion that everyone hoped wouldn't go off too early. For the mother, this meant a permanent shift in status. She gained rank, resources, and visibility, but she also gained rivals, other mothers, other factions, other people smiling politely while calculating how inconvenient her child might become in the future. From that moment on, motherhood became political labor. Mothers had to secure allies, manage appearances, and carefully shape their son's reputation from an early age. A prince who appeared too ambitious was threatening. A prince who appeared too passive was expendable.
Finding the perfect balance between capable and harmless required constant adjustment, like raising a child while also writing their resume for a job that involved ruling an empire. And the danger didn't come only from other women. Officials, tutors, military figures, and court factions all had opinions about which prince would be best. Best in this case usually meant most useful to us. Mothers had to navigate these interests carefully, ensuring support without appearing manipulative. A delicate task, especially when everyone assumed manipulation anyway. Even worse, motherhood made loss more painful and more public. If a prince fell ill, everyone noticed. If he died, everyone reassessed. Grief was expected, but too much grief was suspicious. Too little was also suspicious. There was no correct emotional response, only incorrect ones. The cruel irony is that the very thing that elevated a woman's position also chained her future to forces she couldn't control. Her status rose with her son, but so did the risks. She could do everything right and still lose everything overnight. In the Ottoman harem, motherhood was not a refuge. It was a battlefield with smaller uniforms. And once you stepped onto it, there was no retreat. At the very top of the Ottoman harem sat one woman who did not compete, did not scramble, and did not need to prove anything to anyone. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. If the harem was a battlefield, she was the general who no longer needed armor because everyone already knew what she could do. Her authority was absolute inside the harem and quietly influential outside it. She controlled rank, discipline, allowances, appointments, punishments, and access. She decided who advanced, who stalled, and who suddenly found themselves reassigned to a much quieter palace with excellent scenery and absolutely no relevance. Officially, the Valide Sultan was not running the empire. Unofficially, many people adjusted their political plans based on whether she approved of them. Grand viziers learned quickly that ignoring her opinion was a bold move, usually followed by a short career. She didn't rule through shouting or dramatic displays. That would have been undignified.
Instead, she ruled through routine, through paperwork, through habits, through the simple ability to say no and have that no quietly echoed through the palace until it became reality. And the most terrifying part? She didn't need to move against you directly. If the Valid Sultan disapproved of someone, doors stopped opening, invitations stopped arriving, support faded, allies drifted away. By the time the target realized something was wrong, they were already irrelevant. Other women in the harem understood this perfectly. You did not challenge the Valida Sultan. You did not test her patience. You did not attempt clever maneuvers unless you were absolutely certain she approved, or was at least distracted by something more important. Even mothers of princes deferred to her. Rank did not outweigh experience, and experience in this environment meant having survived long enough to watch entire generations rise and fall while you remained seated. The Valida Sultan also controlled information. She knew who spoke too much, who listened too carefully, and who pretended not to hear anything at all. She did not need spies in the dramatic sense. She had routines, and routines reveal everything. If scandals erupted, she managed them. If tensions grew dangerous, she redirected them. Stability mattered not because she was sentimental, but because chaos threatened the system that kept her powerful. In the Ottoman harem, ambition burned hot and fast. The Valid Sultan burned slow. And in a place where everyone was afraid of disappearing, she was the one presence that never did. If you imagine the Ottoman harem as a place where women competed individually, you're only seeing half the game. Survival was rarely a solo effort. The real power came from alliances. Quiet, flexible, and deniable alliances formed behind curtains, across courtyards, and through people who officially had nothing to do with politics. No one announced these alliances. There were no oaths, no dramatic handshakes, no "we ride at dawn" speeches. That would have been reckless. Instead, alliances formed through shared routines, favors, and carefully remembered kindnesses. A recommendation here, a warning there, an introduction made at the right moment and forgotten publicly 5 minutes later. Servants were the glue that held everything together. They carried messages, observed moods, and noticed patterns long before anyone else did. Treat a servant well, and you gained eyes and ears. Treat them poorly, and you gained a future problem who smiled while memorizing your schedule. The smartest women understood that loyalty flowed downward before it flowed upward. Eunuchs were even more critical. They controlled access, timing, and information. Who entered which rooms, who waited, who was unavailable. A delayed message could ruin a plan. A conveniently delivered one could save a career. Maintaining good relations with eunuchs was not optional. It was infrastructure. Alliances were rarely permanent. Circumstances changed. Favors shifted. People adapted. Loyalty in the harem was situational, not sentimental. Today's ally could be tomorrow's liability, and yesterday's enemy might suddenly become very useful. The trick was never appearing surprised. What made these alliances so effective was their invisibility. On the surface, the harem ran on rules and hierarchy. Beneath that surface, it ran on relationships. Official rank mattered, but informal networks mattered more. The women who lasted longest were those who understood both systems and knew when to rely on each. And of course, alliances were tested constantly. A scandal would break, a favor would be denied, someone would fall ill at a suspiciously inconvenient time. Each event forced alliances to reveal themselves, often unintentionally. Who defended whom? Who stayed silent? Who suddenly remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere? The most dangerous alliances were the quietest ones. 2 people who never spoke publicly. 3 who never appeared together. A network that looked accidental but moved with precision. These were not friendships, they were insurance policies. In the Ottoman harem, no one survived alone, but no one trusted completely either. Alliances were built not on affection, but on mutual understanding of one simple truth. Today's stab could become tomorrow's shield.
Well, when half the population dies suddenly, there's a lot more stuff to go around. Strange how that works, isn't it? You sit up slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the one small window. The house itself is bigger than what you grew up in. Used to belong to the miller and his family. All 6 of them died in the space of a week back in 1348. Their bodies were buried in the churchyard, along with so many others. They had to dig mass graves these days. You try not to think about that too much. The floorboards creak under your feet. Actual wooden floors, not just packed dirt. You inherited more than just a house when the plague finished its work. There's a chest in the corner with clothes that actually fit, a proper cooking pot hanging over the fireplace, even a pewter cup, which used to be something only wealthy merchants could afford. Funny thing about catastrophes, they have a way of redistributing